Marj Peeler, I basically want to just quickly go through some of her early life. She was the wife of Richard Peeler, and the reason I mention that is even as I started doing this, she basically, I thought I can't do without Richard Peeler, and I thought that's the point. She was always in the shadow of her husband. But she talked about observing drawings and color before she could even talk. And she made a lot of fish in her life, so I thought that was appropriate, that 6-year-old picture with the fish. But she did a lot of whimsical work. In high school, I mentioned this because she really was a dedicated artist and took as many art classes as possible, even an extra year, and had teachers. There were 12 art professors, 12 teachers at Tech High School in Indianapolis, and most of them had come from Europe. They were not traditional certified teachers. They had come from Europe and had been professional artists or worked with professional artists, so it was really an opportunity. And as I looked at the high school art here, I was struck with the fact that Marj, in her at 89, 90, remembered her art teachers, and she could go by name and tell you what each of her teachers taught her, whether it was sculpture or this teacher taught me design, and it was moving to realize that meant so much. So those of you who are teachers, it does make a difference, as you know. This is where she met Richard Peeler, and she remembers that he was almost as good as she was, is one of her comments. After art, she went to University of Minnesota, where in the day, ceramics was not in, as you know, many of you, in colleges and universities. There were very few programs. So basically, they did not have one at University of Minnesota. So she did learn ice sculpting and worked with wood. And I show this picture because Richard was in World War II, and then when they got married in 1947, I'm showing this picture because Marj, this is the kind of artist she was. She wasn't a seamstress, but she made her wedding dress. She'd never made a wedding cake, but she made her wedding cake. And then she made a sculpture for the top of the wedding cake. I mean, it was sort of like, it was one big art project. Their first purchase was a 1 cubic foot, like 10-inch high kiln. And they made their living for several years making ceramic jewelry. And of course, it was before plastics, and Marj would say broken earrings gave us our living because people did not have plastic. Marj called her largest sculpture project the Rammed Earth House, and they received an acre of land in the middle of nowhere in Indiana, 16 miles from Greencastle, about 45 miles from Indianapolis. And her husband, they read a book and thought, wow, well, let's build a rammed earth home. And that shows where they were ramming the earth. It was sand and gravel and the list here, and sand and gravel and clay, of course. And they rammed it as hard as they could into the shells of the wall, which were, I think, like 16 feet thick. The reason and then you can see the progress here. So she was actively working on this. It took them about 3 summers to even get to a shell. But the reason that she considered it her largest project is because after the walls, they came to sharp corners. And so her job was to round off all of the corners in the building, which could only be done with a stone chisel. So she chiseled all the corners. It was one big sculpture, actually. And so that was something like I said, she always considered her biggest project. She and her husband made large pieces. Wherever you looked, there was sculpture on the ground in what ended up being like 20 acres in Indiana. So they would have this, the bird on the right is actually, would come up, about 2 feet tall. It's quite large. I think that Richard made it for their children to climb on. And I show this because Marj Peeler was someone like in the 50s, early 50s, women stayed home and by the hearth and raised the kids and did the cooking and cleaned, and she was not able to be an artist. Her husband was the one who went on to school, who went on to teach at DePaul University, and so she wasn't, she was happy to have her sons, but she wasn't happy to not be doing art. And she talked about that a lot in her life later on. So her husband taught sculpture, teaching methods, and photography for 16 years. Let me go back here. Jenny Marsh, one of his former students, reminded me that Marge, a lot of the projects that he would assign to her class, were really ones that Marge had sort of done at home and had talked about. So she was behind a lot of the projects that none of us knew about. Many of you, I'd like almost a show of hands, have you seen the ceramic art films in the 60s? They decided to venture out and do these, so they made 6 films, which were with McGraw-Hill. It took a year while Richard was on sabbatical to film them, and then also another 3 years to edit them. I mean, they're doing it in the summer, and Marge did most of the editing. She was a big part of those films. I don't have pictures of Richard's former students, some of them, but I have some potters now who you know, Richard Burkett, Susie Galloway. There's Marge on the left of the screen, and Jenny Marsh right there by the moon pot. Bing Davis on the far right. And beside Bing Davis is the woman who, she and her husband gave $12 million to DePaul University to build a new art building. And because she was so impressed with Richard Peeler, she named the building for him. He had already passed away, but it was a testimony to giving that much money and not having your name on the building, but having the artist who made a difference in your life. We actually had him the last year he taught. So he left teaching after our sophomore year and started Peeler Pottery. They always felt that go on. So the beginning really was in 1966, but the full time began in 1972. And they made about 10,000 pots a year. That included small pieces, but that's a lot. They felt it began when he came back from Japan and built a wood kiln. And this is a picture of their studio, which started out as just a shed over the wood kiln. Then they built an oil kiln. And then they built the gas also, and it just basically grew over the years. So this was not the original studio. I will ask you to notice on the far left, is on the left or right, that the big bowl that was cast out of cement that Richard made out of the ground. And there's a story about that. So here's a picture of them when they were making their pots. And Marge did a lot of carving and a lot of decorating. Here's a picture of the work they made. They both liked to make individual pieces and sculptures, and in Indiana, that was not a market for that, and so they really committed to making utilitarian ware and did a great job of it. So the goblets are Marge's, and the ramekin is Richard Peeler's. And they made a lot of small things. They paid for their firings with small things between all the pots, these small birds. This is quite large, actually. This is an example of Marge's work. I have this in here because a big part of what her husband did was inspired by seeing a Han Dynasty watchtower. And so he started making these constructions out of slabs and ended up, making really those actually all sold quite well. And he was commissioned to do different things for banks and things. I'll just flip through some of the slides of their work. Marge did her own work too, but she did not learn to throw till she was 40. And at the time, her husband was sort of like, well, why would you want to learn to throw? And she talked a lot about cussed determination. She said, cussed determination got me through building that house, and it got me through learning how to throw. And so here's one example of what she did. She threw, these are 3 globes inside each other. They're actually loose. And if anyone's interested in how she made that, she explained it. Now, you probably know by seeing she threw around each piece, but it was quite a project. Marge developed the bronze glaze that they used on large sculptures. This is probably the only teapot she ever made, but the glaze was on it. And on the far right, there again, Marge was in the background, even when they were doing pots full time. She was always there and always welcoming. But this was her very important person pot, and she made a number of these, and the head comes off. This is just an example. She did a lot with Egyptian paste, and I mean, 10,000 pots. You can just imagine how many things they made during the course of the year. Marj made her own tools. So one of the tools she used a lot was a wooden spoon. So the wooden spoon on the pot with the carving is made by a spoon. She just kind of press it into the clay and turning it and making it look easy. I will also mention that Richard Peeler was not a fan of any. A lot of the potters in the day in the early 50s and 60s, a lot of brown. You would see a lot of brown. So she was really the force behind. Well, let's do blue, and that was sort of like, oh, I don't want to do blue, but they did blue and they did other colors, which were appealing to those who were purchasing them. Some more examples of Marj's work. The bowl with the incising, she was probably in her 70s before color could be produced on high fireware. So she was delighted, and she started doing that. This is an example of work where on the rectangular piece, tall, is Richard Burger, the favorite student, but Richard Peeler's pots where he stamped different designs on them, and then he also made a moon pot after we landed on the moon. But on the right is Marj's, and she carved on many things and decorated them. Marj would say cute cells. Even in high school, she made a little 2.5-inch pin out of balsa wood and pine and painted it, and 4,000 were sold in the bookstore at their high school. So she made her money for college. They sold for 35 cents. 5 cents went to the war tax. 5 cents went to the bookstore, and she got 25 cents. She made a lot of necklaces, lots of birds. Of all forms and shapes. You just name it, Marj made it. She did a lot of wax resist designs, and of course there's another bird on the right. Lots of turtles, and they all, very whimsical work. Mask, just an array of things that she did, and lots of angels. And I was impressed that in the 70s she was really aware of equality and diversity and included that in her work. I had that twice. At some point along the way, maybe Jenny knows, but Marj made Mom's pot. Mom did a lot, but never enough, and it wasn't all that popular with Richard Peeler. They were happily married, but it was like kind of true, and but all the women who came into the studio really, really liked it. In 28 years, they had no broken pots by children coming into their studio, and there were a lot of children who were in the studio because Marj built this percussion contraption with pans and buckets and tin cans that they had it outside, and the kids could play with that. They also, if you saw I mentioned the large bowl that was standing up by their studio, they had Sunfish SeaWorld. And so her husband, Richard, would basically get sunfish and train them to jump through a hoop. And it really, it was a happening to come to their studio. In fact, Marj was proud of the fact that people from every state came to her studio. I was thinking 80 foreign countries, but I had to correct myself. It was just 60 foreign countries of people who came to their studio and purchased pots. So they came from all over the world, and lots of times visiting guests at DePaul University. She didn't stop with her designing when Richard died. When she knew he was going to die, she designed their tombstone and tried to convey what had been an important part of their life as artists and sculptors and potters. Of course, she hasn't died at this point. There's the back of it, showing some of her work. And I don't know how many artists have designed their tombstones, but I thought it was a good idea. But significantly, and why I'm making this presentation, is that for 17 years, Marj was on her own. And while I had met her when I was 18 as a student, years later, I moved back to Greencastle and to raise money for the university, and got to know Marj. She really took me in, and during that 17 years, she designed many new hand-built pieces. She wrote 6 articles for Pottery Making Illustrated. She illustrated 6 children's books. She collaborated with local potters where they would make the pots and she would do the carving or the design. She couldn't, she had some injuries to her shoulder and she really couldn't throw any longer. Um, they had several Peeler potteries at the local history museum. And what that was they put out the word to this community in Indianapolis, Putnam County, for people to bring in their Peeler pots that they had purchased whenever. And the museum took photographs of them, and it was like everyone was just bringing their favorite things in, and thousands of things that, of course, they'd sold over the years. And out of that, they did do a book, which I didn't bring with me, but it is basically a retrospective of the Peelers. I'll say one thing, though. It has lots of duplicates because everyone wanted their piece in the book, even if it had more than one plate. And then she exhibited in the Peeler retrospective with 6 of his former students at DePaul University in the new art building in the gallery. So I love this photo because it shows, Marj, her personality, how she was a redhead. She was, whatever it was, she was going to get it done. And they kept in contact with former students very well. Even though Richard quit teaching in 1972, they were in contact with former students, and they visited back to the studio. And I think they were great correspondents. This is some of the works Marj made after those 17 years, hand-built, of course, and then again, she was so pleased with the designs, the high colors that we go to high fire. And this is an example of the book that came out of the Peeler parties. Marj used to say, it never should have worked, but it did. They were in the middle of nowhere. They did start out with doing wholesale work, but eventually they sold everything retail out of their studio and gallery. And, it was amazing, really, that she said that even as I knew her in the past 17 years. She would say it a lot. It never should have worked, but it did. But she was a big part of that and behind a lot of it. These are a couple of pieces that she worked on with local potters, where they would make the piece, and then she would carve on it, and they would fire it. And this is the last slide, just that she's right there with the Sunfish SeaWorld pond. So she was a big influence in a lot of people's lives. It was an era when women were not really, it was expected, as I said at the very beginning, not to be out there. I sometimes wonder if what she would have done if she had had the opportunity to continue her art and be involved in the ceramics world. In fact, Richard was a founding member of NCECA, and he was an early president in like 1970, I think he was president then. But she, of course, never came to a meeting and was always at home. And happy, but still, she was very happy when he quit teaching at DePaul full-time and they could make pots together. That's all. Thank you.